listeners, welcome back to Reading Realm. Today, I'm finally back with another review. It's been a little while, but I finally finished As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson. This one was really hard for me to start reading, and in the least spoilery terms that I possibly can describe it, it was hard for me to get into because it was hard to see how the character from book 1 and 2 had kind of deteriorated so far by the time it's this book. And not like the writing of the character got worse, but the character, what they've experienced, caused them to become something that I feel like the first book version of them would never have wanted. And so it was really, really hard to get into that at first, just because it was like, oh no, this character doesn't deserve this. This is really rough. But once I got past that, it is a very, very interesting book. Especially in the rest of the series, because it's one where the protagonist is the victim of the thing that she's trying to solve as it's happening, which is a really, really interesting dynamic because I feel like in the other two books before this, she's been very involved in what's happened, but it's either already happened or is currently happening, but to someone else. And so with this one, where it's happening actively to her, it's very, very interesting. And I think that another thing that's really interesting about this, that is confirmed in the author's note of this one, is that you can see the author's opinion of trust in law enforcement for certain things not being taken seriously in the writing. And then in the author's note, she does talk about how there's a really, really bad statistic of how many situations like what's happening here are taken seriously. And unfortunately, it doesn't end well for a lot of people in those real life situations. So I feel like this book is kind of still fictional in the series that it's the last one of, but it's also, in my opinion, making the strongest real world commentary about an actual problem in the actual world, which I think makes it really interesting later in this book, because it takes a really, really dramatic twist. And I have to be so careful. I basically can't talk about the last majority of the book because it is so much of a spoiler, but it is really, really good. And once I got past the part where it was really hard for me just because of the way that the character was, and it was just, like, rough to read that part, I read this whole book, the rest of it, in, like, 2 afternoons. It was... I couldn't put it down. It was so addicting at the end. Like, it was impossible for me to do anything else other than finish it, just because it's like, what is happening? What's going to happen? I have to know. So it's really, really good, and in a way, kind of educational if anyone reading ever is in a situation where they have to mess up forensics about a death, which is, I think, as close as I can say without giving way too much spoilers, but it is really interesting. I would love to see the author's search history, honestly, because I feel like it's so fun when authors look up these crazy things. I'm one of them that would probably get non-author onto suspicious persons lists. This book probably, I'm almost positive, had a lot of those searches because it is very, very interesting. But also very detailed about how to cover up stuff. I will say also, and this is not a spoiler because I'm not going to say any of the details about it, the very last page of this book is so satisfying because the way that the end of this book finishes off, it ends in such a way where there's a lot left sort of unsaid, but the very, very last page, which is very simple, it only has like 2 lines on it. It has like a heading and then 2 lines. And just that gives so much closure with just that, but also leaves it open-ended about another thing where it's like, this is what I hoped would happen for both the thing that there's closure on and the thing that is back to being open-ended, which I wish I could talk about more, but it is a pretty big spoiler. But it is just, I read the ending of it and I was just like, yes, that is the perfect way to end this book, because I was thinking about it and it's like, yes, there very easily could have been something where it was like another chapter kind of giving more attention to the thing that has now become open-ended again. But I feel like by leaving it at very simply, this happened, here's the result, which means this is now going to be an option again, is just, I feel like it's perfect, because I feel like if she had tried to write an actual ending, it would have felt unfinished, in kind of a forced way, where it's like, well, but there has to be more. But the way that she ended it, which I think is really well done, is that it does end unfinished. It ends the start of a different future, which I think leaves it up to reader interpretation what would happen next, which I personally think is the best way that this series could have been ended, especially after everything that happened. Because it feels like it's not a series that has a super tidy ending where it's like, okay, everything has closure, all the ends are tied up. There is definitely a very satisfying thing that happens that is kind of a closure thing. But in terms of the rest of what's going on, I think it was ended perfectly. I also have to say, and this is probably going to be a little bit of a shorter review just because so much of this book I can't say anything about because it is just way too much of a spoiler, and I feel like I am on eggshells trying to avoid saying anything that gives away too much. But the perpetrator in this book, I called it from really early on. I thought I knew who it was, and I was right again. And I just find that super satisfying because it's fun to be right. And I had so many things where it was like, it makes so much sense to be this person. And the book was trying to deflect it a little bit and turn it onto another person in a way that did kind of make sense but didn't totally add up. And I called it from super early on, and I was right, which is always really, really satisfying. So, that was definitely a very enjoyable part for me, being right about it. And also, I will say, I feel like even though this is probably one of the books, or it is the book, where the character is kind of in her worst state mentally for a lot of it, I will say I love that she's still extremely intelligent. And even though there are situations where I feel like a lot of horror movie protagonists would completely freak out and have a meltdown and not be able to do anything, she did freak out. She had a very realistic reactions, but she stayed the intelligent character that she's been from the very first book and even the prequel, which I personally think is something that is really important, because I feel like if she had completely lost it, as people could easily do in the situation she was in, it would feel really cheap if someone else came to get her out rather than her trying to do stuff for herself. Because if anyone knows anything about the protagonist of this series, she is not a damsel in distress. And at first, when stuff started to happen, I was worried it was going to go in that direction, and it didn't. And I'm trying to be super careful not to say too much, but I think that because of that, it made it perfect, because that way it was still her, and even though she was like completely terrified and super vulnerable, as anyone would be in the situation that she was in, she didn't completely lose her intelligence, which is what makes her who she is as a character, because she's been extremely smart from the very first book, or the very first podcast episode she's done. Like, she is a smart person. And I loved that even when she needed help, even when there were more people involved, she was still making really intelligent decisions on her own. Were there some decisions in the book that were not quite as intelligent? Yes. But there were also a lot that were really, really intelligent, well thought out, and educated in a way that I feel was very, like, loyal to who she is as a character, which was important to me. That was how she was written. So I'm really, really happy with the book. I really enjoyed it, and thank you to the person who recommended the series to me, because I don't think I would have read it on my own necessarily if it hadn't been recommended to me on the channel. I really, really enjoyed it. And I haven't read as many murder mystery stuff compared to fantasy or some other genres, and it's one that I'm sort of starting to get into with all the Natasha Preston and this series and everything. But I really, really enjoyed it. Also, and I'm gonna say this really vaguely, but it's really, really satisfying to get scenes where bad characters who do really evil, awful things get what they deserve, even if it isn't getting what they deserve for exactly the thing that they deserve it for. And that's as much as I can say about that. But it is really, really good. I highly recommend it to anyone who likes that genre, the mystery, murder mystery. I will say there is a really heavy theme in this one of stalking, and also some mild substance abuse stuff. So if that's something that may bother you, maybe don't read it. But it is very, very good. And I saw a few weeks ago, there's actually another book by this author at a store that I was at, and I might be interested in reading that. I'll have to look into it once I'm done with the things on the list that I have already to read. But I really enjoyed this. I know it's been a while since I reviewed the first two, so hopefully everyone who wanted to read those gets a chance to, and maybe by the time I review this one, you've read the whole series as well. But let me know what you're reading, or if you've read this, try to avoid giving spoilers, but I'd be happy to hear what you thought of it. Please subscribe if you haven't, it really helps me out, and keep reading. Bye!